Hello there, it's time for aggressive plan against London system. As you know, lately London system, thanks to Carlsen and, for example, Sedlak from Serbia, who wrote two amazing books for white, London system became one of the most popular systems for white. Thanks to Carlsen, Sedlak, but also Grachev and Kamsky, the system became so good. Lately, no one can imagine playing London system without some sort of stability and solidness by white. Although, I thought about what am I supposed to show you here, and finally came up with the following conclusion. After d4, knight f6, knight f3, g6, bishop f4. This is an introduction into London system, main variation. So you can apply only this if you play g6 and if you're a King's Indian or Grunfeld player. Here, Grunfeld players might go with bishop g7 and d5 approach, while King's Indian players go with the bishop g7 and d6 approach. So after bishop g7, e3, castles, bishop e2, d6. It's important to notice that white has to play h3 as soon as black plays d6. Why so? Because as soon as black plays d6, black threatens to play knight h5. Why? Because if the pawn wasn't standing on d6, when you play knight h5, they would have that bishop e5 intermediary move. With the pawn on d6, when we play knight h5, they can't play any longer bishop f5. They have to go bishop g5, in which case you keep chasing away the bishop with h6, bishop h4, g5, bishop g3, and then eventually you take on g3, winning the bishop pair and getting like a very normal position for black, where white has to play game without the London dark square bishop. So that's why after d6 they have to play h3, and this is the moment where we have to stop, and where I especially have to insist on the following move and plan for black. I thought about so many things and positions here. I thought about playing c5. Well, in some variations, white can go for boring lines with c3 and queen b3. I thought about knight bd7, queen e8, and e5. More or less typical King's Indian approach, but not as aggressive as the one I want to teach you in this lecture. Then I thought about b6, bishop b7, double fianchetto, nothing special, kind of flexible for black. And then something crossed my mind. Let me just teach you knight f to d7. Knight f to d7 is one of the most aggressive and unusual systems for black. What do I like about this system for black? The simplicity and the plan that black goes for after you go with the knight f to d7. So when you bring this knight back to d7, you keep following possibilities open. First of all, you want to break with e5 here. Secondly, you open up this bishop on g7. Thirdly, you want to still, improve, support this e5 move even more with the knight c6, and then the real things is coming. You want to play f5 and g5 afterwards. And now it sounds like a crazy plan for black, or how is black gonna fulfill all these ideas and all these, let's just say, moves as a part of the plan. So let's just go with it, and let me just show you how should you play with black pieces. There are so many moves for white. Usually I expect from your opponents to either play normal castle, or just to go with a bishop h2, where they just avoid e5 with the tempi. Although when we play e5, it's as the same as the line when they play so bishop h2 is absolutely the same as castles and bishop h2 and short castle. And in case of castle, you just go e5, bishop h2, and that's the same line. So let me just show you how do we play there. For example, one of the most, let's just say, I would say most typical ideas for white is to develop this knight to d2. It's not considered to be good according to latest theory. White decides too early position of the knight. In many positions, the plan with c4 and knight c3 seems to be more appropriate because they want to go and break onto the diagonal h2 b8, especially d6 and c7 pawns, with c4, c5, knight c3, knight b5, and rook c1 breaking along that diagonal. Here with the knight bd2, it's not going to be possible any longer. So how do we play? We play e5, of course, bishop h2, we play knight c6. I insist on this move knight c6 because as soon as you play knight c6, if they ever play d5 and kick that knight away, you just bring your knight back to e7, and then you have an easy kind of King's Indian typical attack on the king side with f5 and g5. And you just direct all your minor pieces, starting with that knight from c6 that goes on e7 and usually on g6. You just launch the attack on the king side. Since you played e5, they have to decide whether they want to defend the center with c3, what they usually do. Looks extremely boring, and at first glance it looks solid for white, but it's nothing. Or they can just go with d5. d5 is nothing because we have knight e7 threatening this with a tempi. c4, and now you just see how weak is this knight on d2. Of course, you should be going with first h6. So when you play f5, they won't be able to play knight g5 and knight e6. When they go castles, you go f5, and now you want to go f5, knight f6, e4, or just knight e5, and black is doing great on the king side. This is what we like here so much. After knight bd2, e5, bishop h2, knight c6, they go c3. Looks like they've just defended the pawn on d4. The d4 square is very important to hold in order to restrict the activity of the bishop on g7. But here, it just gives us a very easy plan. Let me just show you the game of young and rising world talent Alireza Firozia, who played here f5 against Kuzubov. And he just wants to go with g5 and g4 in case of short castle. Since Kuzubov, Ukrainian guy, is like very experienced in this kind of positions, he went with d takes. Why d takes? Because it just gives this bishop on h2 kind of limited. So after b4, why b4? He just wants to get some space on the queen side, chase this knight away with the tempi, and weaken eventually pawn on e5. If they manage to weaken pawn on e5, they would be able to get like the better activity for this bishop on h2. Queen e7, like over supporting the pawn on e7, castles g5, and this is our plan. So I'm not showing you here like couple of games and couple of analysis, so that's what you have to learn. No. What I'm teaching you right now is typical plan against these London structures for white. So after like queen b3, king h8, b5, knight goes back to d8, Firozia came with this knight on f7, over supporting pawn on e5, and definitely preparing himself with g4. Hope you like this plan. That's all about knight bd2 plan. What happens if instead of knight bd2 they go with knight c3? It's very interesting because this knight c3 is against the well-known FIDE rule, because white needs to help his c pawn. So what is he actually trying to do? After e5, bishop h2. Here d takes, bishop g5 was tried in one game. You should never hesitate to move f6, even though you weaken the light squares, it's nothing. And this dark square bishop is kind of passive here. So you just go with queen e7, knight b6, chasing that bishop away, g5, f5, and boom. We once again have like a typical structure. After bishop h2, knight a5, he simply got rid of this light square bishop, and with the bishop here, with this pawns being stretched from g5 to f5, to e5, black was slightly better and has very promising chances in game. Elias Portish against Donner in Madrid zonal tournament back to, 1960. Black was really fine here, and I very much like black's game. I like the possibility to attack, to play g4, to play f4, to play e4, to have a bishop pair, simply possibility to go with the attack there. That's what I like about these positions. After knight c3, e5, they don't have to take, they can bring the bishop back to h2. That's what I usually expect by guys to do in this position, and then you just go with knight c6. Don't ever forget to go with this knight on c6. Like I told you previously, having your knight on c6 is very important in terms of some d5, where you just put it back to e7, and now you just push these pawns like crazy on the king side. After castles, f5. So if they don't push d5, you always push f5 and g5. That's what I like about the plan with knight f to d7. Knight has moved from f6 to d7, open up the queen on d8 that supports g5 and g4 ideas. So after d takes, bishop b5 is absolutely the best move. And according to some analysis here, king h8, moving the king and putting into safety should look like absolutely the best for black. I would say with mutual chances in this type of game. Apart from knight bd2 and knight c3, which are side moves, there is a move like c4. I very much expect this move to be played by many guys who play in London, because they're used on placing this pawn on c4, knight on c3, breaking with c5 on the queen side, and eventually trying to weaken the pawn structure on e5, d6, and c7, but usually they just try to weaken d6 and c7 squares, followed by c5, knight c3, knight b5, rook c1, sometimes even with knight d2, knight c4. So how do we play? We play e5, bishop h2, knight c6, knight c3, and there we go. If you have nothing better to do, just go with f5. But it's not like nothing better to do. This is just a part of our aggressive plan. If they go castles, do I have to remind you? Just go with g5. D takes, and you always take with e pawn. Don't forget, you always take with this pawn, as long as they don't have queen d5 to grab on e5, and they don't. You always want to, first of all, restrict the activity of the light square bishop on h2. Dark square bishop. Second thing, you just want to push your pawn up to g4 and attack on the king side. I believe when you ask me for some aggressive plan against the King's Indian, this is exactly what you expected against this opening, because usually London players are boring positional players who like solid variations with lots of maneuvering and very calm positions. Well, we gotta just apologize to these guys, because we're not gonna give them such a great pleasure, and we just want to kill them on the king side with this f5 and g5 ideas. So in case instead of castles they take on e5, you take and they play castles. What should you do? I checked the game between De Wol and Stelvagen, played in Netherlands back to 2005. E4. He's just opened up the bishop on g7, but also opened up this London bishop that could be even dangerous. But after knight d4, black played knight to e5, open up this bishop, basically stopped knight e6 threat. Secondly, kind of restricted the activity of this bishop on h2. And at some point he just wants to go with some knight d3 ideas, but position looks good. Knight c6, Stelvagen played b takes c6, which I like. Yes, he maybe just created like the double pawns, and he's got a weak pawn on a7 anyways, but this guy cannot jump with his knight anywhere. Also, black threatens to play knight to d3 to carry on like improving position of that bishop on g7 in the dark squares. And second thing, this queen can go on g5 or h4, going with the attack on the king side. After queen a4, queen e8. I like queen e8 because it over supports e6 and also over supports the knight on e5. After I like rook f to d1, a5. Nice move, preventing any, like pressure on the a7 pawn, and queen a5 ideas by white. So after rook ac1, played g5. g5 I like because it gives you g4 ideas, because it gives you f4 ideas, and because it gives you queen g6, but sometimes even h5 things. Although here everything depends on f4 and queen g6, and these are like two main plans for black. After c5, queen g6, rook d2, f4. I believe that black already had fantastic position here, threatening f3. Sorry, threatening to take on a3. So after e takes, g takes, he threatened f3 or bishop h3, and this is typical King's Indian and typical attacking ideas. Probably this guy thought that after queen e4, he was up a pawn, but after queen g5, boom, he's now threatening f3, threatening mate, and threatening this rook on d2. Bishop g4, captured, threatens this bishop, rook cd1, and played queen h6. After bishop g3, he couldn't take because queen would take on g4, but he played rook a to e1, queen c4, king h8, bishop was trapped. Then he would just have like lots of other threats, and the mate should be inevitable. So this is how the game between De Waal and Stillwagen ended. And finally, let's just go to two main lines, two main approaches and moves I expect to be done by white. Those are bishop h2 and short castle, and it's basically same approach by white. We're just going to have like transposition into one of these two options. In case of bishop h2, you just go e5, and they have two options. To react with d takes e5 or trying to hold the pawn center with c3. Those who play c4, we're just going to analyze that after f5, castles, and g5. And don't worry, we're going to analyze this type of games. Or you can just play first knight c6 and then go with the rest of these things, like over supporting first e5 and then go with the rest. If they go c3, like hyper solid approach by white, you go queen e7. I like this queen e7 approach, showing you a game between a guy who's rated 2200 and black who was 2600. So after queen e7, knight b2, f5, d takes. I always insist, and I'll remind you once again, you always recapture by pawn in order to keep the dark square bishop on h2, which is usually like the strongest piece in London system. So you just keep it closed with e5. After queen c2, knight c6, and long castles were used on short castle kind of approaches. Of course, you shouldn't waste any time. You just push this pawn and go with g4 and just launch an amazing action. After a long castles, knight c5, b4. It has to be bad because he just weakens the eventually position of the king on c1. After e4, which I like a lot because it's typical King's Indian move, and using some sort of tactics, you just get like a crazy position. Knight e4, knight e6, bishop c4, king h8, removing from the pin. Knight b to d3, knight d4, e takes d4, and played a5. This is exactly what I told you. When he played that move b4, he weakened the lot pawn structure around the king, and after a4, black looks amazing. Knight c5, knight a5, queen a4, b6, bishop d7, captured on a6, and this guy resigned. Position was already terrible for white. I mean, maybe their bishop, like on h2 finally looks good, but they can't take advantage of this bishop anyhow. On the other hand, if they take on e5, you always take by pawn. I don't want to remind you of this anymore. Showing you a game of Nepomniachtchi playing black, knight c3, knight c6, castles, and Nepomniachtchi played interesting move a6. I believe this move makes sense, because if he wants to ever use his queen for the actions on the king side, he doesn't want to take any risks with knight d5 or knight b5 to have that pawn on c7, like being hung. So after like a6, a4, knight c5. A pretty solid approach. Wants to trade the queens off. He wasn't forced to do so. Although he also can play queen e7, followed by f5 and g5, which was a classical plan with the pawn c6 because of some knight d5 ideas. So I believe that's why he opted for knight c5, offering him to trade the queens off, queen e7, and after this f5. Don't want to show you the rest of the game. Just want to remind you of the fact that Nepomniachtchi had like more of space. He was the one who came up with g5 and g4 afterwards. That's exactly what happened. But what I want to tell you here, Black was just slightly better in this game. And then let's go to the main line. After knight f to d7, they go with a short castle. You play e5, and they go bishop h2. For example, in a blitz game between Le Quang Liam and Amonatov, played in World Blitz in Riyadh 2017, this Le Quang Liam played bishop g3. It was bad, because this bishop belongs on h2. Why? Because in some variations, if Black starts to push these pawns on the king's side with f5, g5, and f4, f4 will always come with a tempi. So after knight c6, c4, h6, why h6? To be able to prevent f5 with bishop h4, knight g5, so he went with h6, knight c3, and f5. Black was already fine, and Black was better in that game, but eventually they drew the game. That's why they have to put this bishop back to h2. This is absolutely the best and safest position for the bishop. After knight e6, they have lots of possibilities. For example, some players played knight a3 with the idea of knight b5. You just kick this knight away, play f5, go with g5, bring this knight to f6. Any b4, you just bring this knight back to e7, go with bishop d7, and here they threatened to take on d6. Black was supposed to play, for example, bishop b5 and d5, followed by knight g6 and f4. If you ask me, Black has an upper hand here on the king side, even though White has a bishop pair, but I do prefer Black. That's about knight a3. In case of knight c3, this is game between Cruz and Alex Bachmann. So after f5, h6, why h6? Because they want to play just some e4, or they just want to play some g5 before g5. In case of b5, he would have knight e7 without being afraid of knight g5 by White. So after c3, e4, knight e2, knight e7, challenging this knight on d5, c4, knight takes, he takes, knight f6, threatening this, queen b3, bishop d7, and Black was fine. This guy tried to break in the center with f3, rook takes f3, a5, b takes, queen b7, queen b8, and all of a sudden, look at how terrible was this bishop on h2. Okay, our bishop on g7 doesn't look better either, but we can always break it with f4, in which case this pawn on d4 would be hanging. They can push e4. We have like both of these rooks being like fully activated, and they had lots of problems with the rest of their pieces. And after bishop d3, this is what Black just did in the game, played f4, knight c4, rook takes d5, and after like rook d1, played king h8 to remove from the files, threatening knight c3, came up with some crazy tactics, and Black eventually managed to win this game. This happened in Barcelona 2016. Black really played this game on the top of his tactical level, and I very much enjoyed this game for Black. Those were lines with knight c3 and knight a3. What happens if they take on e5? Well, I already told you. So you just take by pawn, knight c3, f5, move your king to h8, and then just go with g5, g4. These positions require some sort of knowledge and experience, because you can't play them just like that. You just need to prepare yourself in order to face this early knight c3 and bishop b5, which is positional approach by White. It was played by Carlsen in one of his games against Rajabov, although you just have to be familiar with these plans. And finally, time for the main lines. Those who play c3, you just go f5, and those who play, they have like bunch of similar moves that are coped with the queen side pressure by black on the king side. For example, instead of f5, I'll show you a game by Predovic, who just played queen e7, knight a3, f5, knight b5, knight f6. That queen on e7 has an idea to defend both e5 and c7. d5, knight goes back to d8, now goes on f7, and finally it supports g5. That's what I told you in the beginning of this lesson. I'm not giving you moves and telling you in 15th move you have to play that, in 26th move you gotta do this. No, I'm just teaching you a very typical plan for black. After rook c1, white was threatening c5, a6, knight c3, g4. H takes, knight takes, is about to remove the defender, the attacker, and I would say the essence of this position. It's the dark square bishop. He captured it and played king h8. After bishop d7, rook g8, rook a to f8, knight g5, rook f6, queen f7, jump with the knight on e4, open up the bishop pair, had like fantastic control of the light squares, and Gavric against Predovic resigned at this point. Predovic was amazing in this position, and look at this, quite a sad position for white, because these two knights have no perspective. You also have like a beautiful pair of bishops. Black looks fantastic. Apart from that, I'll show you a game of Vorobyev, who instead of queen e7 played e4. I'm not a big fan of these e4 positions because it kind of opens up this light dark square bishop, but f5, c4, knight f6, knight c3, knight e7, b4, king h8, rook c1, g5, queen c2, knight g6. I just wanted to show you like this couple of moves as a part of a plan for black. I want to show you like what happened in the game after d5, a5, a3, queen e7, a takes, bishop d7. He fully connected all his pieces, including rooks on the back rank, knight c4, and broke onto the king side with f4. After knight b6, he says, just like Garry Kasparov in King's Indian positions, who cares? And played f3. G takes, c takes, bishop f3, knight h4, bishop h1, bishop f5, saved the rook and killed this guy. This happened in a game between a Russian woman and the Russian IM, Rishkanova, and Grandmaster Vorobyev in 2017. Very nice plan in 2017 by Vorobyev. And finally, you can just play a very typical f5. If you play typical f5, you just want to go with g5 and g4. So it doesn't require any kind of like special knowledge. If they take, you of course take by d takes e5, which looks very satisfactory for you. In case of b4, to advance on the queen side, you play a6 to prevent b5, knight b2, and since they have like a very big difficulties and kind of like problems with pretty stuck pieces, into the center, you can consider playing e4. Yes, it does open their bishop, but it does open your bishop as well. Although this bishop has better control on this diagonal than bishop on g7 because it hits the wall, talking about attacking the pawns on d4 and c3. After knight e1, but we have this nice plan with g5. a4, knight e7. I believe by now you should have learned that the knight goes usually on c6, you bring it back to e7, and you eventually place it on g6 with further g4, f4. So after c4, it looks very logical for white, but at the same time, it looks good for you because it opens a little bit more the bishop on g7. So after knight f6, rook c1, knight g6, c5, d5, c6, b6, a5, b takes, and f4. Beautiful plan by Danny Yufa, and he's about to break onto the king side with f3, e takes, g takes, f3, e3, knight b3, knight h5. An amazing plan by black. white was absolutely killed here. And let me just show you briefly what happened. Knight c5, knight h4, knight d7, bishop d7, queen d7, knight f5, took on there, played knight g3, and had like complete domination. Look at this. Rook is kind of killed, knight as well, bishop here, d4 is hanging, king as well, and of course white resigned. Finally, instead of d takes c5, what I showed you there, and b4, they can also play knight a3. Consider a move like knight a3. You can't move your queen just like that, because they will have an easy knight b5 threatening this pawn on c7 at some point. But after e4, knight e2, knight f6, f3, I don't have to ask you, you can always take on f3 and play g5, but this guy played knight to e7. After like f takes, queen b3, king h8, c4, and bishop e6. Don't want to talk about this one. You can also play it here, h5, followed by knight f5, followed by, for example, rook a to f1 and h4. Black would have fantastic control of the dark squares. Bishop on h2 would be kind of dead. Pawn on e3 would be weak. Bishop on h6 as an idea. They can't play g4 anymore. You would have like full activity of your knight's pieces, and they would be pretty blocked. And finally, they can play a4 with like some sort of expansion on the queen side. After queen e7, you should have became absolutely familiar with this. With these plans, sometimes you play g5 straight away, sometimes you play queen e7 to over support pawn on e5, so you can afterwards go with g5 and g4. In the game between Jonathan Spillman and David Howell, played in London Classic, was a5, trying to do a6 and weaken the light squares. After a6, knight b2, king h8. This king h8 you can take more like kind of preparing move for the king side, to remove from some queen b3 or bishop c4 checks, to have g5, g4, to have rook g8 with the attack on the king side. After b4, g5, knight b3, g4, h takes, f takes, knight f to d2, knight f6, b5, a takes, bishop b5, bishop d7. All things considered, black already launched an attack, and Howell had great attacking type of the game. Well, I just hope that you enjoyed in this small presentation of this line. Hopefully you're going to have like lots of success with this creation, and let's just hope that this is going to present like your long-term approach in these type of games against the London system, because it's certainly one of the most aggressive, most typical, but at the same time easiest plan for black. Have a good one. Bye-bye.